Now then, today I'm very happy to welcome you all to the plenary session on the work of Hans Jonas. And my name is Michelle Mahoney from the Memorial University of Newfoundland. This morning we're going to hear from Nicholas Anderson from Boston College, Paul Wilford, also from Boston College, and Zachary Calhoun from Tulane University. And we'll begin now, without any further ado, with Nicholas Anderson's piece called From Metabolism to Metaphysics, Hans Jonas on the Natural Grounds of Metaphysical Speculations. I give the floor to you, Nicholas.
First, I would just like to take a moment before I begin just to thank Michelle for all the hard work she has put into managing this panel, and it's most appreciated, and I'm looking forward to her comments.
Pleasure.
So I'll begin. In recent years, a number of leading entrepreneurs and scientists have made public their ambitions to continue humanity's conquest over nature. We have heard about the desire, for example, to establish a colony on Mars, the plan to cure, prevent, or manage all human disease, and the desire to seize control over our own genetic future, all of which culminate in the goal of solving the problem of death. Such high ambitions characterize the hubris and Promethean immodesty that drives what Hans Jonas calls the modern adventure of knowledge. While these projects may attest to the optimistic faith that we moderns have in the boundless power of human freedom and ingenuity, they are at the same time symptoms of a crisis that has led to the destruction of the environment and the rise of human alienation. Jonas describes this modern adventure of knowledge as an unceasing dynamism that carries us ever into the future. The modern scientific project in which, quote, theory has become a function of use, as much as use a function of theory, has led to the endless forward thrust of life into the ever new unknown. This unceasing dynamism, Jonas claims, is the result of a mutual feedback mechanism that has, quote, set up a new realm of necessity and that determines man's constant employment in the cave. The new scientific method was established in the charitable hopes that scientific progress would be a means of relieving man's estate. Instead, Jonas claims that these aspirations inadvertently led humanity to be dominated by its artificial second nature. Our society, imbued with the notion that a strict method is the only way to knowledge, does not, quote, leave the meaning of happiness open, and disdains the question, whither goes this unceasing dynamism? The inability or unwillingness to ask the extra scientific questions of value results for Jonas in humanity's lack of control over this unceasing technological process. Envious of the certainty and continual progress of the natural sciences, contemporary philosophy thinks it should take its cues from the scientific method. Philosophy too has become subordinate to man's second nature, becoming a function of use and seeking no more than to clear the underbrush from the path of the sciences. Thus, Jonas observes that two articles of faith rule contemporary philosophy. First, the prohibition against metaphysics, and second, the dogma of the sheer subjectivity of all values. Although Jonas is himself a heretic regarding these dogmas, he believes that the nearly overwhelming consensus on these issues should not surprise us, since it, quote, reflects the succumbing of philosophy to the success of natural science, which it would like to imitate. However, as Jonas points out, this is to fundamentally misconstrue two modes of our mediated relation to the world, which, when adequately understood, prove to be complementary forms of rational activity rather than rivals for our allegiance. Accordingly, Jonas does not reject the findings of natural science, but instead begins his investigations into the grounds of value from the organic fact of biological existence. Through strict attention to the phenomenon of life, Jonas strives to revitalize metaphysical speculation, and such revitalization is the condition for his greater project of finding grounds for an objective ethical system and rediscovering concern in a seemingly indifferent nature. More specifically, in Jonas's philosophical interpretation of metabolism, one can see that metaphysical speculation is an extension of this basic natural fact that describes our existence as embodied creatures. The attempt to defend both the significance of metaphysical speculation for human life and the naturalness of such speculation begins with Jonas's critique of the metaphysical assumptions of the modern scientific project. Although Jonas acknowledges that this project arises from modern philosophy's noble impulse to be the benefactor of humanity, he is skeptical about the belief in progress, which postulates the possibility of overcoming the distinction between is and ought by representing the ought as attainable in this world. For Jonas, this dynamic in turn rests on the presupposition of the Cartesian separation of mind from extension. This separation is the heart of the new metaphysic of science, which Jonas argues drains nature of her spiritual and vital attributes. According to this view, nature is entirely and exclusively external, existing in opposition to human interiority. This dichotomy is, quote, the metaphysical charter for a purely mechanistic and quantitative picture of the natural world that renders the world subject to manipulation. The master of nature presupposes that nature is one homogeneous substance whose essential attribute is extension, and the knowledge of which is essentially the mode of measurement and mathematical description. While securing the independence of the measurable, Descartes' separation of mind and extension leads to the mind's alienation from the world on account of its complete ontological detachment from nature. In thinking of himself as separate from nature, man suffers the tension of being an embodied mind, of his essence being limited by accident. The desire to overcome this tension underlies, for Jonas, the psychology behind utopian politics and the modern theories of moral progress. In other words, it is a psychological source of the idea that by reforming the cave, we can be at home in the world. According to Jonas, Cartesian metaphysics fails because its dualism cannot account for metabolism, the definitive feature of all organic beings. By transforming the material of its environment into its sustenance, the organism, quote, transcends the mere matter of its environment, which provides the organism with a basic freedom that consists in the independence of its, quote, form with respect to its own matter. In other words, there is no immediate identity between organism and the matter that composes it. But organism cannot be understood by being treated as mere extension. The independence of the organism's identity constitutes its freedom. Yet the price the organism pays for this individual freedom is death. Sooner or later, it will give in to the continual crisis that is the condition of its existence. Through dealing with this ever-renewing crisis and by issuing a constant challenge to mechanical nature, life exhibits a concern for itself, insofar as it fights to prolong its existence and maintain its form over time. All organic life possesses an awareness of a self that is distinct from the other of the surrounding environment. In this act of self-maintenance, life enters into a horizon environment and a horizon of time, in short, a world. The more complex the organism, the more complex its world relation, and the more mediated is the being's relation to its surrounding environment. While the more complex mediation comes with greater freedom, there is also greater hazard. The more sophisticated interactions an organism has with its environment, the more possibilities it has for failure. Humanity's unique forms of mediation are more sophisticated, yet still the uniquely human activities of reason do not, on that account, belong to an ontological realm wholly distinct from extended nature, as Cartesian metaphysics postulates. Nevertheless, with the mind of man, Jonas insists that there emerges, quote, a new mode of dealing with the world. What begins in metabolism as the emancipation of form from matter culminates in the human's ability to interact with and transcend his environment through abstract thought. Thought could be understood then as the most complex form of metabolism. Through reflective activity, man interacts with his environment and creates an image of himself that transcends mere embodiment. Metabolism may be the first form of freedom, and the human's capacity for abstract thought could be said to be the highest, most sophisticated form of metabolism. With this continuity between metabolism and thought, Jonas highlights the human being's uniqueness within, but not his isolation from, nature. In contrast, modern dualistic metaphysics takes the stark foreignness of human thought as its starting point and seeks to transform the world in the image of isolated man. As the culmination of the hierarchy of mediation, the human being engages with its environment in the most complex and dangerous ways. By the fruits of its intellect, humanity has given itself the power to destroy its natural home. What most distinguishes humanity from the rest of creation then is not freedom, subjectivity, or inwardness, but responsibility, which Jonas argues is grounded in that same capacity for reflection. Such reflective activity is most characteristically expressed for Jonas in St. Augustine's famous phrase, "I have become a question to myself." Jonas writes, quote, "Religion, ethics, and metaphysics are the never completed attempts to confront this question within the framework of an interpretation of the totality of existence." This never completed questioning is paradigmatic of the new mode of metabolism that emerges with the human being. In man's self-questioning of himself, the emancipation of form from matter enters the immaterial realm of thought. Through such questions, the human interacts with its environment, changes it, thinks along with it, and is changed by it in turn. That is, the human forms a distinct kind of ecological niche through the character of his theoretical reflections. This self-relation constitutive of human subjectivity is, for Jonas, the basis of morality, since man's responsibility extends not merely over himself, but also his place in nature. Ethical thought as well as speculative reflection extends from the individual self to the whole of existence in which the self finds itself situated. That is, there's a duty for man to reflect on the whole. Jonas thus insists on the necessity of metaphysical speculation for the stewardship of nature. Our moral responsibility cannot be separated from our ability to engage in inquiries into the nature of our being. Accordingly, the alternative mode of philosophical thought Jonas seeks to open for the modern mind does not shy away from questions that have been deemed unanswerable and therefore avoided on the grounds that such matters are fruitless. Jonas argues that philosophy should once again be permitted to be speculative. At the same time, Jonas's insistence on metaphysical speculation is intended to encourage humility toward our technological power, out of the recognition that man is ignorant of the whole. Jonas's notion of metaphysical speculation thus does not attempt to replace one set of dogmas with another. The point of reflective activity is not to arrive at a set of definitive answers to the riddles arising out of human life, but to encounter and hazard answers to, quote, the ultimate questions, or what he also refers to as the philosophia perennis, the perennial philosophy. So as Jonas acknowledges, the Socratic I know that I know not has proved to be the beginning of philosophy. So such Socratic ignorance informs Jonas's attempts at metaphysical speculation. For example, his use of metaphysical myth, whereby a suffering God risks its own purity in creating a universe that allows for the possibility of self-consciousness to emerge, attempts to capture some aspect of the ontological facts and ethical implications he uncovers through philosophical reflection. It depicts the forever mysterious origin of human reason and our wonder at the phenomenon of embodied rationality. Still, Jonas's myth makes no pretension of being a genuine theological account. Instead, the mythical cosmology and account of the suffering God serves as an example of the speculative and tentative questioning that makes the human being unique as a creature potentially aware of its own limits. This encouragement of knowing what one does not know is motivated in part by the responsibility that our great power over nature demands, quote, a new kind of humility, a humility owed not like former humility to the smallness of our power, but to the excessive magnitude of it. The impetus to discover this modest orientation toward the whole derives from the fear that humanity may act on the worst of its Promethean impulses. An awareness of ignorance of the whole would aid us in restraining our desires to master the physical world. However, Jonas's greater hope seems to be that this epistemological modesty toward the whole will control the hubristic disposition of the modern project through the possibility of opening up inquiry into the supremely, to quote, the supremely useful and much needed knowledge of ends. So Jonas seeks to recover the ability of the scientist, philosopher, or more generally the contemporary human being to reflect on the extra scientific questions of ends, for the contemporary human denies the very existence of wisdom's object, which is objective value and truth for Jonas. So one might accuse Jonas of promoting a naive vision of philosophy by claiming that he overlooks the confluence of historical circumstances, including conventional and linguistic constructs that mediate the understanding of human experience. In contrast to Jonas, one might claim that thought is bounded by its historicity. Such historicism, Jonas might argue, is itself a result of the authors of modernity and the anthropology of perfectibility. Instead of denying the facts of ordinary human experience, as many modern theories of philosophical abstraction appear to do, Jonas argues that we should consider our experience as embodied at rational beings as the most fruitful starting point of philosophy. This trust in ordinary and embodied experience, combined with the posture that philosophical answers are tentative, explains the peculiar combination of daring and modesty that constitutes Jonas's vision of philosophy, a vision best summarized by the tension between longing and dissatisfaction. That is, Jonas encourages us to indulge the metaphysical eros that the prohibitions of modern philosophy would like to neuter. Yet we must be prepared to remain unsatisfied. Philosophy for Jonas holds us in a state of zetetic suspense. To conclude, humanity's technological power has grown immensely during the same period in which philosophy has renounced metaphysical speculation and refused to indulge the philosopher's highest longings. Indeed, as Jonas writes, we need wisdom most when we believe in it the least. Jonas argues that the contemporary human denies the existence of a form of wisdom that transcends the methodologies of modern science, either because he is convinced of modern dualism's success, or because he despairs at the disenchantment of the world, being persuaded by the historicity and thus relativism of all thought. Jonas seeks a path between the excessive hopes of the modern project and the despair of contemporary nihilism. The critique of the suppositions underlying Cartesian dualism is the first step towards freeing us from the technological process and the cave of modernity. This critique opens a modern mind to the alternative ethics of responsibility and its emphasis on metaphysical speculation. A less hubristic ethical orientation depends upon a more modest philosophical posture. Only by engaging with our natural longings for metaphysical speculation and with the questions that most concern human existence does Jonas think the ethics of responsibility will find a fruitful soil to take root. At the very least, a modest yet questioning orientation toward the whole, characterized by knowledge of ignorance, will aid humanity in its hopes of proceeding into the future with fear, humility, and caution. And although fear, humility, and caution have a central place in Jonas's ethics of responsibility, he does not leave us devoid of hope. This hope is found, fittingly enough, in the biological facts present in all organisms, namely natality and mortality. In the natural cycle of human youthfulness, humanity finds its ever-renewed beginning. Youthfulness comes with the, quote, unique privilege of seeing the world for the first time and with new eyes, ensuring the durability of the experience of wonder, the beginning of philosophy. Jonas thus provides us with hope that we can become responsible stewards of our environment, because there lies in the condition of our nature enduring access to what he and many others have called the riddle of existence.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. And without further ado, we will continue and we will ask Paul Wilford to please read his paper, which is entitled, I've lost my screen again, I apologize. Right. Paul, would you like us to read the title of your paper, please?
Yeah, no. So first, I just want to echo Nick's thanks to Professor Calhoun, to Holy Cross for all the support that they've given, and for the kind of tireless efforts of the behind the scenes activities that make all of this possible during these strange and peculiar times. So my paper is entitled Alienation from Nature, Hans Jonas on Reason's Gnostic Temptation. Hans Jonas' early study of Gnosticism seems a world away from the contemporary concerns animating the imperative of responsibility. What relevance could the study of a Christian heresy have for understanding our current condition, for grappling with anxieties about our power to render our biosphere uninhabitable or to play God through genetic manipulation? According to Jonas, Gnosticism represents one of the more radical answers of man to his predicament. And the very radicality of the philosophical position brings to light a fundamental feature of human nature, namely the temptation to adopt a negative and critical posture toward the natural world, a spiritual comportment that insists on a sharp distinction between soul and body, spirit and nature, self and world, in which the former is elevated at the expense of the latter. From the perspective of the Geistige Geschichte, this is Gnosticism arises at a time when the spiritual verities of the past have lost their binding force. But Gnosticism is not merely a historically contingent byproduct of socio-political or economic forces. Rather, Gnosticism is an expression of a perennial possibility, a comportment to the world in which the mind seizes upon our experience of duality and offers a totalizing interpretation of our being in the world on the basis of a set of radical antitheses. In Gnosticism, Jonas espies a surprising forerunner to Martin Heidegger's existentialism, according to which there is no source of value outside of Dasein's resolute confrontation with nothingness. In Jonas's words, it was his, quote, extended discourse with ancient nihilism that proved to help in discerning and placing the meaning of modern nihilism, close quote. The similarity between Gnosticism and existentialism rests on a common judgment that a fundamental incongruity between man and nature precludes our being at home in the world and obviates the very possibility of uncovering a natural standard by which we might guide our conduct. When nature is hostile or merely indifferent to human purposes, human subjectivity must ground its own norms, lest the human be wholly bereft of orientation. For Jonas, existentialism is the destiny of the logic of modernity. For once teleology has been ejected from the system of natural causes, values are unsupported, and the self is thrown back entirely upon itself in its quest for meaning and value. Close quote. Thus, a Christian heresy from the Hellenistic age illuminates the logical endpoint of modernity as the metaphysical presuppositions of modern science play themselves out and leave man without any guidance in an alien world. My presentation will briefly adumbrate Jonas's genealogy of our nihilistic moment before exploring the parallel connection between Gewoffenheit and human historicity, that is, between thrownness and the historical particularity of our situation in both Gnosticism and existentialism. Section 1, the origins of nihilism and the Gnosticism of modernity. Jonas locates the beginnings of our contemporary crisis in the 17th century, where the spiritual situation of modern man takes shape. A characteristic feature of this situation is man's loneliness in the physical universe of modern cosmology. According to Jonas, Blaise Pascal is one of the first to recognize the spiritual consequences of the new cosmology. Quote, cast into the infinite immensity of spaces of which I am ignorant and which know me not, I am frightened, close quote. The source of Pascal's profound unease is the incongruity between man with his purposes and the cosmos, the incommensurability of the human perspective with that presupposed and confirmed by modern scientific methods. Modern man alternates between two opposed spiritual postures, one that sees the human as dislocated and another that is doing the very dislocating. For Pascal, it is the deafening silence of the cosmos that is so terrifying. Quote, the indifference of this universe to human aspirations, the not knowing of things human on the part of that within which all things human have preposterously to be enacted, which constitutes the utter loneliness of man in the sum of things. Close quote. Recoiling from such horror vacue, the individual must turn inward and attempt to find a haven in the depths of her own interiority. For such a self, quote, meaning is no longer found, but is conferred. Values are no longer beheld in the vision of objective reality, but are posited as feasts of valuation. Will replaces vision. Temporality of the act ousts the eternity of the good in itself, close quote. Pascal's God is far more mysterious than that of the more orthodox Catholicism of the 16th and 17th centuries. The deity is, in Jonas's formulation, an agnostos theos, an unknown God. Rather than finding in nature a reflection of our imago Dei, a confirmation of our being created in the image of God, it is our isolation and the uncanny contingency of our being somewhere in particular, amidst the vast immensity of cosmic space that stirs heart and mind to reach for something outside of the world that could make our condition coherent. God has become, for Pascal, the extra mundane principle that lies beyond the edge of the horizon of intelligibility. For other than the immensity of the infinite, we observe no signs of God's presence. Pascal's God is thus a deus abscondus, hiding behind nature's indifference. And yet, because of nature's indifference, man needs God all the more if our life is to be meaningful. Pascal's religious response to nature's indifference, however, is far from the only alternative. For Descartes, a deus abscondus attesting only to his power through the immensity of existence leaves man in the existential condition where the only proper orientation to the world is one in which we strive to make ourselves like masters and possessors of nature. For Jonas, the deep connection between the presuppositions and the aims of the new science is decisive. If nature is nothing but extension, then it can rightly be manipulated to our purposes, the willful anthropological response to a willful God. The practical telos, in contrast to ancient theoria, is correlated to the new science's presuppositions about the nature of nature, which in turn reflect an onto-theological thesis about God as the ground of an indifferent nature. The inscrutable willfulness of the unknown God demarcates a limit to our search for meaning. Rather than attempting to answer the why of existence, we should, in Bacon's formulation, concern ourselves with the amelioration of our condition. According to Jonas, the final consequence of the Deus abscondus, of whom nothing but will and power can be predicated, is the homo abscondicus, a concept of man characterized solely by will and power, the will for power, the will to will. For such a will, even indifferent nature is more an occasion for its exercise than a true object, close quote. With the final departure of Deus abscondicus, Jonas draws a surprising connection between Pascal's loneliness and Nietzsche's atheism. For the death of God follows from the leveling and homogenizing of being by natural science. And the will to power is the final attempt by the solitary subject to assert meaning in a world where the highest values have lost ontological support and so have devalued themselves. In a thoroughly disenchanted world, a world without a why, without a logos, the human's capacity to will is the only source of distinction in an otherwise indifferently uniform cosmos. Part 2, human historicity and the eschatology of Geworfenheit. Gnosticism is characterized by a radically dualistic mood, resting on a passionately felt experience of self and world. The self's existence is structured by two dualities, between man and the world on one hand, and concurrently between the world and God on the other. This doubly structuring dualism characterizes the situation of these three interrelated terms, man, world, and God. Although man and God belong essentially together in Gnostic mythology and theology, in opposition to the world stands between and thwarts their union. Although man and God ought to be united, the world's existence, its brute facticity, obviates such unity. Mundane existence, including the individual's very embodiment, does not mediate the self's relation to God, but stands as an obstacle to that longed-for unification. Man, confined within a rebarbative world, has his true source of being outside the world, beyond all natural experience. The self's incarnation is the source of the self's self-alienation. The Gnostic's knowledge is accordingly both diagnostic and remediative, as consciousness of the soul's alienation is not only a self-discovery, but also the means to a recovery of one's true self. One's turning inward and away from the world is complemented by a leaping beyond and behind the given world. The Gnostic pursues a double movement, initiated and directed by the moment of insight or intuitive comprehension, the decisive aspect of which is cognizance of one's own thrownness. Clemens of Alexandria, this is a Hellenistic Gnostic, offers an exemplary formulation of such emancipatory knowledge, or gnosis. Quote, "What makes us free is the knowledge who we were, what we have become, where we were, wherein we have been thrown, whereto we speed, wherefrom we are redeemed, what is birth, and what is rebirth." Close quote. This series of antithetical pairs that are categorically distinct discloses that the truth of our ostensibly variegated experience of a multifaceted world is, in reality, a layered either-or disjunction. Concomitantly, however, the series of dualities grounds a teleological directionality, and the tension between the concepts expresses an ontological commitment insofar as happening and movement are more fundamental than permanence or rest. implying that the change of becoming is more important than the identity of being. The epistemic counterpart to this ontological thesis is accordingly, quote, the knowledge of a history, in which it is itself a critical event, close quote. Jonas connects the Gnostic's description of the self as thrown into its current state with Pascal's description of man as, quote, cast into the infinite immensity of spaces, close quote, and Heidegger's notion of Geworfenheit as having been thrown, which according to Heidegger, quote, is a fundamental character of the Dasein, of the self-experience of existence, close quote. Jonas observes that in the Gnostic imaginary, dualities of existence are contingently connected. Quote, life has been thrown into the world, light into darkness, the soul into the body, close quote. Each aspect of the world we experience is the result of an antagonistic composite that lacks intrinsic unity or wholeness. That is, in each case, there is no reason for the former to be present in the latter. Thrownness expresses the lack of an adequate reason, sufficient cause for our being in the world. Quote, it expresses the original violence done to me in making me be where I am and what I am, the passivity of my choiceless emergence into an existing world, which I did not make and whose law is not mine, close quote. In being thrown, we are ab initio not at home, and as ejected into the world, life is a kind of trajectory projecting itself forward into the future. In the perpetual onrush of what is to come, the present holds little sway, and the possibility of the transtemporal and eternal is likewise consumed in the evanescent present. The only moment outside the transient experience of becoming is the moment of gnosis itself, the moment in which we behold the fundamental truth about our condition and thereby grasp a stable principle or arche, which standing outside the absurd spectacle of human life in an alien cosmos, serves to guide the self through its worldly sojourn. In Heidegger's terminology, the authentic present is the moment when, quote, the projected future reacts upon the given past, close quote, and the dynamic conjunction discloses the moment, Augenblick, of the present that is without presence and only is as this present, the peculiar particular instant of revelation for the authentically existing individual. The present, as product of dynamic self-projection, means that Dasein is essentially restless, for there is no mode of temporality wherein it might abide. Dasein leaps off from its past and projects itself into its future. If authentic, it there comes face to face with its ultimate limit, death, and returns from this eschatological glimpse of nothingness to its sheer factness, the unalterable datum of its already having become this, there, and then, and carries this forward with its death-begotten resolve, into which the past has now been gathered up. The present is present only as, quote, the moment of crisis between past and future, close quote, as the moment where the possibility of decision and need for resolve is disclosed, the moment where we take possession of ourselves by resolving to affirm our past, by actively taking ownership of the arbitrary, fateful dispensation that grounds our world, and projecting a future for ourselves in full awareness of the contingency of existence and the arbitrary facticity of our being. The experience of Geworfenheit and the accompanying mood of dread is, however, the only validation of the claim that one is, in fact, thrown into the world. In prioritizing the bare existing individual to human nature or human essence, Heidegger's existentialism in Being and Time gives credence to the self-validating truths of individual experience. It is the uncanny, unheimlich experience of homelessness, Unheimlichkeit, that grounds the existentialist theory, which then provides an interpretation of that experience as the pre-reflective awareness of the fundamental truth of the human condition. The implicit logical circularity that is so readily denounced by analytic critics of Heidegger as a vicious circularity is treated seriously by Jonas. For the question of the starting point or entree into a philosophical system, where one begins and why one begins there, is far from straightforward. and Jonas readily acknowledges this. Why not begin from personal experience? After all, where else could one begin? Indeed, experience has the virtue of immediacy and subjective certainty. However, whereas the mediation of all forms of communication has the common world as its referent and can be subject to intersubjective examination and confirmation, individual experience has nothing outside of itself to serve as a touchstone for its validity. Despite the difficulty posed by such questions, Jonas has, however, already countered one aspect of the existentialist historicist thesis by uncovering an experience common to two very different historical epochs, the Gnostic and the existentialist. However, Jonas raises the question of whether such an experience is revelatory of the fundamental truth of the human condition, or is an historically inflected expression of a possibility in human nature. That is the Gnostic existentialist position the truth of our condition, or a perennial temptation to which we are especially subject in spiritually desolate times? If the position rests on an experience, is that experience the lens which discloses the ultimate ground of our being and the truth about our being in the world, or is the experience indicative of a failure to inhabit the world and recognize our place within it? This question is decisive, for the experience at the heart of both Gnosticism and existentialism is either the courageous and resolute facing up to the nothingness of our being in the world, or a flight from the work that confronts human beings always and everywhere in their effort to live serious lives according to non-arbitrary standards of the good, the just, and the noble. Conclusion, from phenomenological critique to positive philosophical teaching. When he first set out to explore Gnosticism for his dissertation, Jonas had thought, quote, the categories derived from being and time, published in 1927, such as Geoffenheit, thrownness into the void of the world, Verfallenheit, fallenness, Verlorensein, abandonment, and Grundbegrifflichkeit der Angst, fundamental disposition to dread, had helped to decode the Gnostic myths and to grasp the singularity of the movement in comparison with other religions, which consisted first and foremost in its characteristic understanding of existence, Dasein, close quote. That was early Jonas. Yet Jonas came to see that existentialism, quote, which claims to be the explication of the fundamentals of human existence as such, is the philosophy of a particular historically fated situation of human existence, and that an analogous situation had given rise to an analogous response in the past, close quote. Rather than presume the truth of Heidegger's teaching, Jonas reverses the order of operations and asks whether Gnosticism unlocks the truth of existentialism. In this metanoia, Jonas realized that he had hit upon two forms of nihilism in two remarkably different historical epochs, and thus discovered a means of approaching, quote, both contingency and necessity in the nihilistic experience, close quote. Although the discovery of the structural similarity in the two forms of nihilism does not diminish the force or seriousness of the nihilistic experience, it nevertheless is already a repudiation of Heidegger's own diagnosis of the nihilistic situation of late modern European man. For the possibility of recurring modes of existence raises serious doubts about the ineliminable particularity of Dasein's being in the world, which forms the basis of Heidegger's Seinsgeschichte and the corollary account of Seinsvergessen, or forgetting of being, that together make up Heidegger's radical historicism. Rather than a slow and fateful forgetting of the question of being, there may be permanent possible postures that the mind might take with respect to the world. Consequently, one is justified in concluding that the validity of some of existentialism insights is confined to a particular situation. If Jonas is correct in his judgment, if Jonas is correct in this judgment, then a Gnostic reading of existentialism should disclose existentialism's true ground in a false presupposition of man's alienation from nature, thereby enabling us to move beyond the nihilistic situation of the present and recognize our capacity for responsibility as coextensive with our privileged place in the cosmos. For Jonas, our mediated relation to nature is not only the condition for our freedom, but also the source of the perennial temptation to flee the world. Yet rather than seeking to escape said alienation by turning inward, Jonas enjoins us to embrace the burden of responsibility as the only path by which the self-conscious being might be able to discover a local habitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And now, Zachary. I welcome Zachary Calhoun to begin your talk. And I do have your title on my other screen, which is called The Greatest of Gods, Deathless Earth. Hans Jonas and the Ethical Ground of Environmental History. You may begin when you wish.
Thank you, Michelle, for helping put this together and preparing the comments, and to everyone else, including Paul and Nick, for your great papers. So I'll just start. In the imperative of responsibility, Hans Jonas claimed that, quote, "the nature of human action has changed, a shift that calls for a change in ethics as well," end quote. Previous ethics thought that human action fit within the walls of the city, but that we recently gained the ability to influence the planetary biosphere as a whole. The environment is no longer the deathless earth of Sophocles, who now sounds almost like a eulogist. With our ability to alter the conditions of natural life comes a responsibility to safeguard what Jonas called the possibility of genuine human life. How could we write the history of this shift, which amplifies our powers even as it forces a new precarity upon our species? The early modern drive to bring the natural whole within the realm of human action was realized in part by Galileo, Newton, and Darwin, but also by thermodynamic physicists like Hermann von Helmholtz and Sadi Carnot, who drew on technologies of steam and heat engines to found a predictive science of changes across holistic systems. Both Carnot and Helmholtz cited Kant as an inspiration for their sciences of the planetary whole, not to mention the new technologies that allow us to traverse that whole with ease. In 1854, Helmholtz said that this was because there was much to gain from the planetary aspect of Kant's polymathic teachings. And Sadi Carnot used a Kantian metaphor to suggest that thermodynamics and steam simply expanded the island of pure understanding, bringing the natural whole as such within the realm of empirical science and within the political grasp of technocrats with steamships and heat engines. Kant developed his own planetary thought about nature and human action to realize the modern goal of peace in cosmopolitan horizons. His turn to the global aspirations of modernity was motivated by his awareness of the need for ethical corrections to Bacon and Descartes' dream for a totalizing mastery of nature. Now, Jonas recontextualized this Kantian legacy in several ways. He sought a futural ethic of responsibility that framed the categorical imperative to account for the global and existential ramifications of modern technologies like nuclear weapons, genetic modifications, and climate change. Quote, "by curbing our powers over creation, lest we perish together on a wasteland of what was creation," end quote. I argue that Jonas's environment owes as much to Kant as do his ethical imperatives. Both reappraisals of Kant are linked. Jonas's future-oriented ethics adds a new moral idea to the ideas that Kant had proposed as ends for the modern project, bringing an obligation for, quote, "the stewardship of nature" within ethics would push the necessary rethinking beyond ethics into metaphysics, in which all ethics must ultimately be grounded, end quote. That new idea could be glossed as the environment, a global responsibility to safeguard genuine human life in our future. At issue here are not only questions about human relationships with the natural whole, but also historical questions about how the nature of human action has changed. Environmental history is a recent subdiscipline of history that claims to tell stories of just this kind. So what is it and what are its motivations? Well, according to J. Donald Hughes, environmental history, quote, "seeks understanding of human beings as they have lived, worked, and thought in relationship to the rest of nature," end quote. Environmental histories have explored topics like deforestation in ancient Greece, Dutch adaptations to the Little Ice Age, the origin of fossil fuel economies, and other stories of people who either tried to master their natural situation or adapt to disruptions in it. Among these are intellectual histories of the environment as a concept. In his 2018 book on this theme, The Post-War Origins of the Global Environment, Perrin Seltzer argued that the environment was an idea that the United Nations formulated in their effort to mobilize a world-minded approach to the management of nature. Drawing on ecology, the recent experience of the Dust Bowl, and the scale of natural resource stockpiles required in World War II, the United Nations fostered, quote, a liberal democratic world community that built the international knowledge infrastructure that made the global scale environment a political reality, end quote. The environment then became a concept after post-war consolidation made it a political reality. Similarly, the historians Paul Ward, Libby Robin, and Sverker Sorlin argued that the environment was conceived as an entity in its own right after the establishment of the first multilateral climate research groups in 1948, such that already by 1965, scientific groups could declare, quote, the entire planet can now serve as the scientific laboratory, end quote. According to Ward, Robin, and Sorlin, there were 4 dimensions to the concept of the environment that converged between 1948 and 1965. First, futuricity, the way that scientists identified a general degradation in the world and felt it incumbent upon themselves to provide solutions. 2, expertise, or a capacity to consolidate information at scales beyond anything an individual collector could achieve. 3, the quantification of planetary processes, which permitted the conceptualization of society as an engineering project. And 4, facility with scales and scalability, which allowed researchers to link the local or microscopic to the planetary whole and back again. So the environment as a concept, these historians argued, needed all 4 of these dimensions. Post-war geopolitics facilitated an environmental expertise for the future, made of scientists and peace planners who saw themselves as the foremost voice of nature. So these histories also agreed that this concept of the environment, that it preceded 1970s environmentalism. Yet they also hold that it was always a political entity, conceived in the post-war effort to professionalize natural resources management in the liberal democratic organization of industrial nations. But these histories rarely, or at least to my knowledge, never consider the modern philosophers whose ideas inspired post-war interpretations of the natural whole. As Jonas saw, many of these ideas, like that of a United Nations, were drawn from Kant. After World War II, Jonas returned to Germany and visited his former teacher, Julius Ebbinghaus, asking how he had stood fast against Nazism. And Ebbinghaus replied, quote, without Kant, I wouldn't have been able to do it, end quote. That sentiment was becoming common in that decade's international courts, established to condemn the Nazi regime, where Kant was often cited. The consensus was that Kant foresaw the 1940s dawning belief in the efficacy of global perspectives on ethical obligations in political relations. I would suggest that Jonas remembered that when he wrote his own Ethic of Nature. Okay, so the idea of human history changing the natural whole, the idea of the precarious environment, is rooted in modern proposals to make ourselves like masters and possessors of nature, bringing nature itself within the ages of human dominion. Jonas feared how modern technology can undermine its goals by deepening our alienation, becoming a force of its own that imperils the possibility of genuine human life. This horrifying twist on the Cartesian Baconian dream entails that to determine nature for technological ends, human nature and reason also had to change. But this idea that Jonas feared, technology outstripping human agency, as it unsettles the ontological security of anything it conquers. It has a precedent in Rousseau, who argued that man is naturally good and that it is from these institutions alone that men become wicked. Human solutions to human problems become new problems in themselves, creating an alienation from our original ends that draws us farther away from the problems we first set out to solve. For Rousseau, this cycle of increasing alienation was apparent in the progress of modern science and technology, as well as culture. And then after reading Rousseau, Kant investigated the sources and foundations of modern cultural ends. Living during huge technological changes to the waterways of the German landscape, projects that Frederick the Great used to consolidate his vision of the modern nation, and that Heidegger would later bemoan in his essay, The Question Concerning Technology. Kant, at the time, had every reason to feel optimistic about the Baconian project. He thought that he could help direct modern ambitions toward their proper end, making use of the powers of reason in a way that was commensurate with our desire to feel like we belong within the natural whole that surrounds and sustains us. Human history and culture could subsume the natural, but to ensure that human projects for the future do not forget our proper ends, the desire for the whole, the modern project of mastery must submit itself to the critique. Kant also reassessed the natural whole in light of teleology. In the third critique, he said that mechanical explanations of nature, so all explanatory science, should be subordinated beneath the reflecting judgments principle of moral teleology. The teleological way of judging sees planetary nature, rendering it meaningful for historical agents. The mechanistic claims of the Baconian project are secondary, Kant's claiming, to the teleological judgments we use while charting historical futures. Kant's interpretation of nature was future-oriented. It was also geographical and biological. It was concerned with juridical and scientific expertise. It was capable of translating between different scales, and it was about the combined progress of natural, historical, and legal change. In other words, Kant's interpretation of nature was strikingly similar to the four dimensions of the environmental concept that historians say emerged after 1948. Just as post-war research groups started against the context of the United Nations search for world-minded institutions, Kant defined nature against the background of modernity's drive for human emancipation from our natural limits. When he proposed the League of Nations, he hoped to guarantee peace by accepting the fact that human thought and action have natural limits, which we should not try to exceed. His critical insight was a futural principle of restraint, based on reflections about the natural context of political ends, and it depended on ceding at least some ground to the idea of nature having ends in itself. For his part, Jonas saw his own ethics of the future as a modification of Kant's categorical imperative, which originally stated, quote, "Act so that you can will that the maxim of your action be made the principle of a universal law." For Jonas, that rational universalizability could not account for the urgent fact that the horizon of technological development is always receding. A matrix of possible actions today cannot account for the unprecedented futures that later generations will have to endure. Changed to a compass restraint for the open future, Jonas's imperative now says, quote, "Act so that the effects of your action are compatible with the permanence of genuine human life," end quote. That idea of genuine human life explains the anxieties we feel while reflecting on the risks of modern technology. Without feeling the risk of losing something fundamental to us, without our sense that something might be lost, we would never feel inspired to look back on the changing nature of human action with the urgency that drives both environmental history and Jonas's research. Nor could we justify an ethic of restraint that closes doors to certain futures. Environmental history helps us see where we came from to better articulate where we can still go. But this thing that we might lose, this possibility of genuine human life, this does not have a single concrete shape that we could discover in the actual historical past. Rather than fetishizing any ancient regime, Jonas was worried about losing the ability to freely determine our future. It is not to preserve any particular prelapsarian past, but precisely to preserve the open future for Jonas that warrants restraint with technological and environmental alienations. After the war, Kant helped Jonas consider ethical and political questions in his new conception of the natural whole. Jonas insisted that his speculative metaphysics of nature was centered on the concept of freedom, the very same concept that, according to Kant, quote, "constitutes the keystone of the whole structure of a system of pure reason, even of speculative reason," end quote. So if environmental science depends on scalability, Jonas saw the human capacity for metaphysics as the bridge that allows us to move between these different scales. Any metabolic organism, as Nick showed us, has an existential freedom because it inserts itself into its environment and embodies its precarious finitude. Freedom in this most basic sense is coeval with life. And in that sense, Jonas held a surprisingly continuous view of the relation between humans and the rest of the natural world. But Jonas also thought that the uniquely human capacities for metaphysics and technology provide us with the responsibility to preserve just connections between individuals and wholes. If environmental science uses scale and scalability, Jonas, inspired by Kant, provides a simultaneously metaphysical and ethical perspective on the responsibilities entailed by our ability to bridge such gaps and transform our nature. Crucially, to abandon metaphysics in favor of scientism would be to ignore critics of the modern project. Metaphysics contemplates the natural whole and imagines what it means to live genuine lives within it, a kind of reflection that is essential to break free from technology's hold over all natural and human beings. And to achieve that end, Jonas insisted, we need something more than technocratic solutions to problems that technology itself created. And that last idea might seem obvious, but recent history suggests otherwise. In instructive environmental history, Gökçe Gönül's Spaceship in the Desert examines an ecological utopia in Abu Dhabi called Masdar City, which promised, quote, all the benefits of 21st century living, yet none of the stresses of outdated 20th century cities. Its architects sought technical adjustments within indefinitely open horizons, aspiring to mitigate climate change through new business models and technological innovations, end quote, but without proposing any changes or restraints to the existing political economy. Crucial to Gönül's analysis is her discovery that these planners deferred the question of success or failure in reflecting on their work. They saw Masdar City as a place where, quote, previously unimagined technologies would terraform the surrounding landscape as a space of experimentation, end quote. This was a spaceship in the desert, a raft of luxury and clean conscience that never set standards for success. So they sought endless technical adjustments, never fretting when their rail systems never functioned or when nobody used their green currencies. That wasn't a problem. The problems with this approach as a whole were foreshadowed by Jonas and also by Kant and Rousseau. As Gönül says, quote, technical adjustments are a means for vaulting ahead to a future where humans will continue to enjoy technological complexity without interrogating existing social, political, or economic relations, end quote. They promise technology will fix itself without our having to ask what we hope to safeguard in the first place. Like the nuclear vaults of the previous century, these are created spaces that only seem to eliminate the dangers of the technological world because they're so sophisticated at ignoring it, or as Paul talked about, forgetting it in a way. If we hope to regain autonomy, Jonas thought, we cannot become servants to the idol of technological progress for its own sake, pursuing only technocratic fixes to technological problems. We must also step back and reflect on the ends that we pursue in the first place. So in conclusion, the idea of environmental history originated in a conception of responsibility for the future, forged when Enlightenment figures like Kant sought limits to the early modern mastery of nature project. As Jonas shows, environmental history is grounded in anxiety about losing access to the possibility of genuine human life. That anxiety also depends on the metaphysical idea of a precarious environment, of a natural whole that can change to account for human history. Environmental history sees human action as something that can change, like Jonas, but only because the free and ethical dimension of our existence is grounded in a part of nature, about which science on its own can say nothing. For all its claims of difference with the anthropocentric tradition that it follows, environmental history very much belongs to this Kantian tradition. Without metaphysics, of course, it would be empty of ethical content. And without ethics, environmental history would be blind to the metaphysical anxieties it addresses and the ends it was first invented to serve. All right, thanks.
Thank you very much, Zachary. Well, I'd like to just say a few brief words, but before I do, I want to thank you for the quality of each of your presentations. They're all very, very, very well written and well delivered. And I think that the breadth of topics will keep us quite busy here. So I'll be quick with my comments and let the floor have the say. First of all, thank you so much to Larry Calhoun, Holy Cross College, because this is an amazing event to have pulled off, given the challenges and potential obstacles that you did not let stand. It's a great affirmation of the Socratean model. We can meet in the Agora, we can talk at institutions, and we can talk in our sitting rooms across the globe. Yes, so many thanks to Larry, and thank you very much to Nicholas Anderson Zachary Calhoun and Paul Wilford for their excellent scholarship and tenacious determination to successfully open up the direct discussion of the work of Hans Jonas, as well as his lineage to Kant, to Heidegger, to Nietzsche, and indeed to the early Greeks. Our theme, nature and its meanings, could not be more timely as the clock ticks to mitigate against the imminent threat of global warming. Calhoun introduces a call from Hans Jonas's book, The Imperative of Responsibility for a Change in Ethics, to address the condition of the planetary biosphere in order to face responsibilities for, quote, the possibility of genuine human life, quote, close quote. He arrives at the elegant arc of recognition for all its disagreements with the so-called anthropocentric tradition it follows. We require both an ethics backed by metaphysics and an ethics to rise to meet the metaphysical mandate. A stewardship of nature is the bond between the two in universal law, the categorical imperative. We need to revise this view to reinvest in embracing the truth of our value-laden realities. As we learned in Mario De Caro's talk, how can we engage with scientific realism in order to achieve this goal? There is not one ontology in science, nor is there in philosophy. Chemists do not deny that their work comes out of physics any longer. In other words, the relationship and fluidity between the sciences can be seen in the causal pluralism that makes it clear that there were never real relations that were epistemically separating facts and values. Each field of science has its particular mission which defines its purpose and therefore its valuation. We cannot distinguish valuation from our understandings and purposes either as philosophers. And this is why there is an indispensable role for a case for emergentist treatments by philosophical leadership, which might also help to assess the aims and health of planetary care. This is the task of philosophy, to work out how such leadership can be built. Now, in the direction of these papers, I think you take on one of the most difficult extremities of potential obstacles philosophy has given us, because you both deal, all three of you deal with the extremity where the very alienation of humanity itself drives us further away from hope for actually being able to work with science and being able to build that common ground and leadership that's so badly needed. A few just specific remarks and then I'll be done. We see in Nicholas Anderson's discussion that Jonas insists that we override what he sees as two contemporary problems: the prohibition against metaphysics and exactly that, the issue of the so-called subjectivity of values I just alluded to. And this returns us to De Caro's purpose. We must take responsibility for our values within the scope of particular goals and within an assessment of methodologies with respect to the phenomenology of experience. By making our values clear in context, discussion can begin. Jonas, however, seems to focus energy upon developing values as only tangentially connected to the material world. If, as Anderson puts this, the issue is that Jonas identifies the failure of philosophy with a tradition that cannot accommodate metabolism, he is attempting to identify metabolism with immaterial thought. This is Jonas, and it's very fascinating, and again, points to the extremity of Jonas as a particularly pivotal, strange person to be discussing here. So the immateriality extreme is what's going to drive us forward back into the arms of nature in a certain sense, it seems to me. Now, in order to talk about these two things, we're talking about a philosophical position itself on Jonas's part that's laden with fundamental presumptuousness about the value of our relationship with time and temporality, because he is attempting to eschew time in a certain sense by making our thoughts the source of metabolism rather than a basis in embodiment in a way that might jeopardize some aspects of the problem. I think that relates to its Gnostic sources. I mean, if freedom from the very conditions that sustain us, freedom in life, as opposed to freedom in abstraction alone, it's as if, you know, the embryonic fluid that you live in, that we have a radical desire to leave the very thing that is going to allow us to find a solution to the problems we face between science and philosophy, that I think are at the root of all the hope that we have going forward. So the uniqueness of, okay, this is a quote from Jonas. So how Jonas is developing this statement, quote, "The uniquely human activities of reason do not belong to an ontological realm wholly distinct from extended nature. But his diagnosis of the problem looks at the human projections as an unceasing dynamism that's now called a second nature." So we've got a division that's set up within his assessments that, again, reinstates barriers rather than ways forward. This awareness of the other, of matter, which is outside our thinking and imagination, is, as Anderson explains, a highlighting of human beings' uniqueness within it. I found it difficult to grasp how to get back around the bend again. So I felt like if I was playing a digital game, I'd be panicking because I watched my signal slide out of view. How is Jonas offering an explanation of human self-reflection as a solely human attribute, while at the same time attempting to engage us with experience, albeit as not necessary to human valuation of thinking? However outrageous this may sound, it sounds like it's a short trip to a brain in a vat. I'm having nightmares of that sort of extrapolation occurring, which I realize isn't at all accurate, but the way of speaking that emphasizes so much the alienation of us from our embodied, from the unity of thinking and being as temporal beings, I find pretty disturbing. Indeed, surely I can pull back from this radical reduction of both nature and human nature, of which we are a species. Indeed, Jonas, quote, his insistence on metaphysical speculation is intended to encourage humility toward our technological power, out of the recognition that man is ignorant of the whole of nature. This seems to reinforce his alienation again of the very nature of the human being itself. Now, Wilford, you're situating Jonas's Gnosticism as an expression of a perennial philosophy and a comportment to the world, where mind seizes upon this duality, which does indeed appear to rest upon a radical antithesis, as you say. He joins Heidegger in this pre-Socratic aim to deny a place of value for facticity. Heidegger's Dasein is a being toward death in its search for authenticity, but Heidegger's inspirations of aesthetic and natural beauty are a dream that die when he gets to his moment of, as Dasein, of overcoming temporality and this worldly existence. The idea that metaphysical presupposition about modern science are responsible for our current dilemma, as he says in the question concerning technology most specifically and obviously, don't square with the fact that we are instigating these metaphysical prepositions. Jonas is, Heidegger is, Dennett is. We've got to deal with what it is as scholars to run with these people's ideas, and then as all three of you do, step back and say, okay, to what extent am I willing to not combat the very positions that we are trying to reveal the sophistication of, if you will. So I really think that this notion of the barrier of the world itself is made to feel as a trap for man who yearns for the otherworldly still. The double recognition of alienation and thrownness is a perverse freedom. There's layers of dysfunction. The present is lost to us, and our need for the future is alien still. I think I'd love for you all to talk about at some point the extremity of the mediating force that we have to deal with Jonas's thinking. But these are very general comments, and I would prefer most of all now to take questions from our participants, please. Mm-hmm. Would you like to show me your hand if you'd like to ask? And I've got the chat opened as well. Adrian Black? Oh, sorry, Michael, you were the first hand up. Michael, Richard, and then Vincent.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. I also want to thank everybody for being part of this, and especially Larry for organizing it. I put my question in the chat. I could read it quickly just for everyone's benefit. This is mainly for Paul, but it's open to everybody on the panel. What sort of diagnosis would Jonas or would you give to the new popularity of Foucault-inspired analyses of power and knowledges? We have knowledges now, not knowledge, including those analyses which focus on biopolitics, necropolitics, and so forth. Is this a new kind of Gnosticism, existentialism, nihilism, or something different? And if it's another iteration of Gnosticism, what's unique or different about Foucauldian Gnosticism?
That's an outlandishly broad question, Michael. I can't possibly do you justice there. No, I'm just joking. It's good to see you and good to see everyone virtually. It's a great question, actually. And I think it really does get at the heart of something that I did begin to point to in my paper, that when our natural experience or the givenness or the manifest world as we inhabit it and the structures that we're relating ourselves to, I'm trying to use formulations that would apply both to how we would react to a natural environment and our, say, socio-political, cultural environment. When those appearances, the way that things show themselves, are when they seem to be devoid of meaning, or the meaning has been evacuated out of them, or they're simply appearances, there's a kind of false show rather than a revelation of some intelligible order. The temptation seems to be that you want to jump behind the appearances and you posit a realm behind those appearances that is then open to manipulation. And again, I'm trying to put it in a way that would encompass both how modern science operates, but also what I think might be going on in some of the phenomena you describe. If there's no inherent rationality or order to the structures that are presenting themselves, but they're merely products of will and power, then we can, undermine them and get behind them much more easily, right? It's sort of the presupposition of changing the world we experience is that the world we experience doesn't have a logic to it, and that presupposition goes together with this focus, I think, on power and willfulness. So the question made me see that what you get in this Foucauldian language of power dynamics as giving rise to the social world is very, very similar to this description we get of the unknown God that is simply the willful creator who doesn't give us any intelligible world. It's just the brute facticity of thatness. And it's in reaction to that this is Jonas's analysis of what's going on. It's in reaction to the idea that God is willful but not intelligible, that it makes sense for us to take the posture of masters and possessors of nature. And I wonder if that's the analog to the situation you're describing. In a world that is simply the product of power, it makes sense for us to just take power to combat that power and to remold it in whatever way we want. But then it would seem that both of these projects are in the problem of how do we know what we want and how could we critically describe what we want? If it's just power, why isn't it not my momentary whim that makes me want to remake the world to make it more hospitable? It seems that both would answer that our current situation, whatever the current situation might be, whether it's just a physical discomfort, right? Before modern technology gives us this abundance and plenty, people were cold and hungry and starving, very often. Whether it's that or it's a kind of spiritual or psychological discomfort, both of those would be these negatively determined sources of motivation. It seems that they would still, whether it's the Mastery of Nature project or the more Foucauldian mode of wanting to remake the world to make it more hospitable, it would be difficult for them to posit a positive telos that we could move towards, rather than just being kind of reaction to a current dissatisfaction with the state of things. That's something like the beginning of an answer, but I think it's a really big and deep question. And
I ask because Foucault has been so much of an influence now in a lot of what's happening in philosophy departments and political science departments and theology departments and culturally, broadly speaking. But it sounds like there's a positing of an unknown God in Foucault's analysis, and it just turns out that unknown God is ourselves.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, this is maybe another route into the question, Michael. I was teaching Hobbes recently in my fundamentals class, my intro to politics class. And, Hobbes says it's all power as well, right? And that's all we're after. It's power after power that ceaseth only in death. And everything is power. Natural wit is power. Beauty is power. Friends are power. Reputation is power. Honor is power. Money is power. I wonder if that would be a way into this question, that the Hoopesian view of the world, that is at, close to early modern and also quite close to this Foucauldian view of the world. I should cut myself off there, though, because I've rambled on too long.
Wonderful conversation. Vincent, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you for 3 excellent papers. But I must confess that in the face of canonization and hagiography, my more heretical impulses are inspired. And that goes to Kant. Kant is as much part, if not more, of the problem that he's as he is towards the solution. And I don't think it's a cheap shot, actually, given how formal, abstract, and from a Hegelian point of view, I think, and rightfully, empty his notion of duty is. The Nazis were good Kantians.
Ooh.
So I don't doubt that certain professors were saved from them by their appeal to Kant, and I don't doubt the Nazis were acting in good conscience by their appeal to Kant. So I don't, and he's such a deeply Cartesian thinker. It's there's a denial of animality at the center of his philosophy. So I don't see him as the way out. I see him as providing some resources, but the problematic side of Kant has to be identified. Second, how could we ever evolve, even emerge, in a completely hostile and indifferent universe? The answer to that question is very simple. We could not. The universe sustains our very being in ways we refuse to acknowledge. That's why the notion of natural piety is so fundamentally important. And piety is a sense of our indebtedness, our gratitude, and in some respect, our loyalty to whence we came. And that's not a bad starting point for the beginning of ecological consciousness. Thank you.
That was a very fine statement. does anyone want, any of the speakers want to directly address this, particularly on the Kant point?
Sure, certainly. Yeah, I think on the just yeah, as brief as I can. I would just begin by saying I think that the piety point is something that Jonas is very much concerned with. He ends his book about his new existential biology with a very much, it seems like a very just a very pious theology, sort of genealogy of life that's entirely indebted to his understanding of faith. And that's all I'll say about that. That's not what my paper was about. I might leave that to somebody else, but I think Jonas is an interesting source for that kind of correction to the piety-free interpretation of natural things.
Thanks. Yeah.
But yeah, with respect to Kant, I thought, yeah, the quote that I included from Jonas's biography, where he's talking about Julius Ebbinghaus, and without Kant, I wouldn't have been able to do it. That's supposed to be a kind of joke. It's a ridiculous statement to say that this alone. But my point in the paper, at least, was that Jonas was inspired by the very same turn that all of these early environmental scientists were also inspired by, which was Kant. So in terms of historical genealogy, I think we have to begin there to understand what we're talking about. Nothing in my paper, at least, was intended as any kind of defense of Kant. I could perhaps venture that, but that's not where the thrust of the paper was coming from. The point was rather to see whether Jonas, first of all, to try to point out the similarities, because when these environmental historians, who are perhaps more indebted to Kant than anybody else that I know, because their framework is so much like parts of his, when they don't talk about that side of their genealogy, when they only look to the history of ecologists, I think they're very much missing the sense of metaphysics and that sense of a need to talk about ends, and of Kant's, frankly, of Kant's idea of being critical about the ends that we're uncritically pursuing, which I think is the main point where Jonas is so indebted to Kant, is the idea that we can't just push forward with technological fixes to technological problems. We need scientists, we need pace planners, but that alone will only further alienation. We need to address ends to ask the question of ends before we can do anything else. And that's the real point of the it's that question of ends and not being forgetful of them that I was at least intending to point to. Yeah, which, by the way, the Nazis were very much not capable of doing. That's not the side of Kant that inspired them.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're gonna, George, would you like to carry up your point?
Or well, just since no one else so far has stepped forward to defend Kant from robustly from Vince's savage attack, let me try. I find it implausible to believe that the guy who literally invented the discipline of anthropology, taught the first courses, coined the term for what those courses consisted of, the details of human beings and living things and their impact on one another, the whole point of which was not to ignore our animality, but to recognize that it didn't get us off the hook when it came. We could not appeal, as so many others did, to our humanity or animality as an excuse for not doing our duty, including for not doing our duty to those who were persecuted during the Holocaust. I would think would be fairly consistent with the Kantian position. I don't think it's an empty or abstract notion at all, although I think a lot of people read it that way and have taught it that way or have portrayed it in that way as an empty formalization, Hegel among them. But I think it doesn't work. It doesn't stand the test of comparison to the corpus, and that I can imagine how someone would say it was only the absolutely irreducible features of Kantian morality that saved me from temptation during, the Nazi period. I don't find that at all implausible. like Vince, I'm a skeptic on many other aspects of, and I have my own skeptical questions about Hans Jonas and his attitudes towards technology in particular. But I think this one at least deserves some further consideration.
Okay,
Ready to go.
Since you appeal to the anthropology, he was black from head to foot. Therefore, I knew he was devoid of reason. Kant.
Okay, guys, we're going to stop this right here. I've got George. I've got the esteemed Larry Calhoun, who's got to speak next. And then I've got Melvin, and we only have a few minutes. So I'm sorry to interrupt because I do want to hear more about that.
No problem. Vince, I'm coming up. I'm going to get.
Larry.
I didn't raise my hand, but Melvin did.
Oh, I saw Melvin. I saw your note about. Oh, I am sorry. I confused you next to each other, Melvin. It's yours.
Really confused.
Thank you. Please.
Well, I'll link two things together. One, that one shouldn't forget that the critique that came last was the third critique, where Kant collided with this problem himself. But the more constructive thing is the emphasis on metabolism shouldn't go so far as to neglect the other chapters of the phenomenon of life, where Kant moves from one level to another, very much in Larry Calhoun's model of showing how each sort of builds upon the one before, but adds something emerges there, which then exerts a downward causation on the other. The chapter on the nobility of sight, particularly, what happens is, and the contrast between vision and the other modes of sensibility and so on, is really, a detail. Some of the best. I used to use this in place of science in the modern world because it was so hard to teach that in the class that I dealt with these matters. But the phenomenon, I did it because I could use it in my contemporary course, both to handle process philosophy and to handle phenomenology, because they're beautiful examples of both. I'll leave it at that.
Both George and Vincent, if you want to carry on, we have a couple of, we have a minute or two. And George, you made a comment on Jonas' skepticism, which the speakers might be interested in hearing.
Well, it was a kind of a quibble, a minor quibble about that skepticism concerning technology. It struck me as we were considering that in the presentation, the conference that you just praised, Michelle, Larry, for having set up, was a kind of refutation of that position that cannot, human beings are the source of a great many, if not most of their problems. And yet it's the same, not the same individuals, but the same species that addresses and corrects those problems. Technology is a piece of humanity. It's a human artifact. I realize you can't just blindly expect technology, and I think this is probably what Jonas had in mind. Just sitting around waiting for a technological fix is not the right way to respond to environmental degradation. But it may be that response in terms of moral obligation takes one to technology. I cite in my little comment there the work being done now on helping to reduce carbon pollution from using animals for food through a technological fix that when fed to cows would cause them no longer to, well, it would improve their efficiency of digestion and eliminate most of the carbon, which turns out to be an enormous amount, 20% of the world's total from feed animals. So, that's a technological fix. It's inspired by human ingenuity. Why should we dump all over that? just because it's called technology. I just had my doubts about that.
Yeah, I think I too in my original comments had mentioned, we make a god out of technology, so we don't have any responsibility for what we've actually continued to propagate.
Right.
I agree with you. What, Nicholas, do you have anything you'd like to add?
That, I guess, Jonas's critique of technology is that it shouldn't be the sovereign force in society or something like that, and that's what it seems to be. So there are these fixes, but they often produce more problems. And I think even we see that with things like Zoom or during the pandemic, they produce problems of their own. But I don't think he's trying to just do away with technology or something, but just to think about it in the context of ends, just to preserve what's good in it.
Thank you. Melvin, did you want to carry up the last point there?
Actually, the imperative of responsibility was delivered as the Terry lectures at Yale, and as it happened, I was there. And he contrasted that with what he called, I don't think it was original with him, the technological imperative. Now, he's not, to respond to George, he's not saying each instance of technology is bad or technology in general is bad, but the technological imperative was if it's possible, it's necessary. I would also, though, and maybe I'd go back to Michael Bauer, because if you follow Foucault into the Paris lectures and the late stuff into the care of self, you get a different Foucault. He's talking about governmentality, doing a constructive political philosophy. So people who talk about Foucault who stopped reading him are not aware of the, where his own thinking carried him. So I just wanted to put that in his defense. But the lectures at Yale, of course, didn't encompass the whole thing. There weren't that many of them, but it really was mainly setting up the dilemma. And for all of George's talk about the various things we might do, little amendments and so on, the question is, what will happen if we just let the technological process go forward at the moment when we're very near the point of no return? I mean, my challenge of technology is to try to save one of the last great places on Earth, and whether we'll be able to do it when the water's got to come up 6 feet in the near future is a very, very iffy question.
All right, I think with just check Paula and Zachary, are you, would you like to say anything else before we leave the session?
I think just to thank you for being very patient with with me and my late delivery of papers, and for being such a good moderator of the conversation. And I think, just thank you so much for putting this all together. And thank you, Michael, for that great question.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, everyone.